Yeah, so as Jonathon Lauscher just said, it's kind of difficult to know what to say to you guys about the USA because I think everybody probably knows quite a bit about the US already. And so it was very difficult for me to come up with something to tell you guys today. So I hope you learned something, and if not, I'm sorry. Okay, so I wanted to start out my presentation with a question. What does an American look like? Any ideas?
Like home.
I'm one, right? So I mean, maybe you think, okay, maybe this is what an American looks like. Right? So I'm American, and this is what I look like. You might think, well, this isn't really a good answer. How about that? maybe that's what an American looks like. Right? So what does an American look like? I did some research on Wikipedia, of course. We have some data about racial and ethnic categories in the United States. And so you can see, this is from the 2020 US Census, about 57% white, about 18% Hispanic and Latino. Do you guys know what this is, what this means? Yeah, this is basically people who have Latin American or Spanish ancestry. About 12% Black or African American. About 6% Asian, and some people are two or more races. We have Native Americans, right? Some other race, and Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islanders. So one of the things about the U.S., it's a diverse country, right? There are a bunch of different racial and ethnic categories represented here. And it's a diverse country. So that's something that I think is kind of interesting about the US. I also looked up something on Wikipedia regarding ancestry in the United States. So ancestry, most of the people who live in the United States now, their families did not live in the United States forever. Right? Except for these people, the Native Americans, the ones who were originally in the U.S. before it was the U.S., right? In North America. But all of the rest of us, we're from somewhere else in the world, ultimately. Our families are from somewhere else in the world. And so, you know, it turns out about 13%, over 42 million, have German ancestry. Kind of interesting. Then we have almost 40 million identify as Black or African American. There are a lot of people of Mexican ancestry in the United States, over 36 million. People with Irish ancestry, over 31 million. English. And then originally I was confused by these two categories. We have American and Native American. So what does this mean? Native Americans are the indigenous peoples of the United States, right? So here we have Yuanjumi, right? In the United States we have Native Americans. These data are based on self-reports from people talking about their ancestry, basically. Right? And there are some people who just say, I'm American, and that's it. These are typically white Americans who are far removed from and no longer self-identify with their original ethnic ancestral origins. Right? So it's possible that a long, long, long time ago, they had maybe German ancestors. But that was a long time ago, and so now they just identify as American. Okay? So again, if you look at ancestry in the United States, it's a very diverse place, right? We have various European ancestries, right? German, Irish, English, Italian, right? We have Black, African American, we have people of Mexican ancestry. So these are the top 10. And I think I calculated these numbers. This is 70 or 75% of the population total. There's other people too, but again, the US, a diverse country. So I asked you a trick question. I'm sorry. But since I teach a class called Critical Thinking, I feel like I'm allowed to ask trick questions all the time. So what does an American look like? Well, you could look like you're from anywhere in the world and still be an American, right? Basically, it's impossible to determine whether someone is an American based on what they look like. I guess maybe unless they look like this. Right? If they look like this, you might say that guy's probably American. But otherwise, right? Ancestry, diversity. You could look like you're from anywhere in the world, but you could still be American. Okay, this is a map of the United States. Do you guys study this when you're in school? There's no reason to. Right? You can learn a little bit now, though. I will not quiz you on this map. There will be a pop quiz, but I will not ask you about this map. Right? One thing I wanted to point out here is it's a big country, right? These are the 50 states. Sometimes people cut up the 50 states into different regions, and there's many ways to do this, right? So here we have the Northeast. These states up here, sometimes called New England. Here we have the South, Texas, and some of these states. Sometimes people call this the Southwest rather than the South. We have the Midwest, and then the West, and some people talk about the West Coast as well. So there are different regions, and the different regions are very, very different from each other, right? And I was thinking about how to explain some of this to you guys. Who is from northern Taiwan? So like Taipei, Xinbei, Taoyuan, who is from the north? And who's from the south? Okay, so we got like Tainan, Kaohsiung, those places, right? And I'm sorry, but we'll skip the middle. Right? Well, who's in the middle? Who's in Taichung? Let's be fair, right? Yeah. Anybody from other places? Hualien? Yilan? Yilan? Yeah, Yilan is beautiful. Anybody from the outlying islands, like Jinmen? Yeah. Okay. So we got people from the north, the south, the middle, the east coast, the west coast, right? Are those areas pretty much the same or totally different from each other? Who thinks they're pretty much exactly the same? And who thinks they're very different from each other? Only one? No one knows what to say, right? I say this because I teach a writing class and I ask my students to compare places where they live, right? So my students who are coming from Tainan, they usually compare Tainan with Taipei. And if you're from Tainan, do you think that Tainan and Taipei are pretty much the same or totally different? Who thinks they're the same? And who thinks they're very different? They're kind of similar. I have students who say they're totally different from each other, right? People from Tainan are very warm and nice, and they'll stop and talk to you. People from Taipei are very busy, and they walk very quickly, and they have no idea who their neighbors are, even though their neighbors live right next to them, right? And then sometimes I have students from Hong Kong, and they compare Hong Kong with Taipei. And they say, those places are totally different. People from Taipei are nice and warm. They always talk to you, right? They walk very slowly. So, everything's relative. But you have something similar going on in the US. There are similarities, but in southern Taiwan, I guess people are known for their hospitality and that sort of thing. It's similar in the South. The South is known for its hospitality. People in the Northeast, especially New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, people there are always working and always in a rush to do something, right? Kind of similar in some ways to Taipei. So the Midwest, this is kind of like the countryside in the United States. Right, slower pace of life, just like some of the countryside areas in Taiwan. So there are big differences between these different regions. I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and sometimes when I'm traveling in other parts of the United States, I feel like I'm in a completely different country, basically. It's very different. So one of my favorite things about the US is music, and I realize that the print here is probably too small for many of you to see, but it's basically a regional breakdown of different genres of music, different kinds of music, based on where they developed and where they're popular, right? So, up here we have the New York, Philly area, Baltimore. We have Baltimore jazz, Baltimore club. We got punk rock up here. Hard bop and bebop are kinds of jazz music, right? We have a lot of stuff on the West Coast too. Cool jazz, surf music, West Coast hip hop, right? So, one of the things that I like about the U.S. is, you may listen to some of these different genres of music, different kinds of music. So blues, well, I don't know if anybody listens to blues or jazz here, but you've probably listened to some rhythm and blues or hip hop music, right? Basically, all of these genres started in the U.S. So a lot of popular music that you may be familiar with ultimately has its roots in the U.S. And a lot of popular music ultimately has its roots in blues and jazz. Without blues and jazz, there would be no rock and roll, there would be no hip hop, there would be no rhythm and blues. And all of these genres basically began as African American music in the U.S. And it happened in the U.S. because there was kind of a mixing of different musical traditions, right? You have mixing of elements of African music, European music, and other sorts of music as well. And so, sometimes if people ask, what has America contributed to the world? Well, I think one good thing is music, right? America has contributed other things to the world, good and bad, but I think, jazz, rock and roll, hip hop, those are all good things that Americans can, say, hey, we did something good for the world. We did some other things too. Okay, so a little bit about me. I told you guys I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we're basically talking about this part of the map here, Pennsylvania. And I lived here during graduate school, Baltimore, Maryland, which is probably about a 5 or 6 hour drive from Pittsburgh. And of course, now I live here. And I tried to make this to scale in Google Maps, which took a while because I had to, drag the mouse all the way from Pennsylvania to Taiwan. But you can see, one of the things that I emphasized here, it's a big place, right? I think you can fit Taiwan inside of Pennsylvania, right? Don't try to do that. It'll cause some damage to the earth, but yeah. So these are the areas that I'm most familiar with, and the areas that I'll talk a bit about in a moment. But other areas of the U.S. I don't know so much about. Okay, so this is a photo of my hometown, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What do you guys think when you take a look at this photo? What's that?
Many bridges.
Yeah. That's a great thing to say. Actually, Western Pennsylvania, I'm not sure if it's Western Pennsylvania or Pittsburgh in particular that has more bridges than anywhere in the world, basically. So, yeah, it's a city of bridges. There are a lot of bridges here. One thing that I thought, sometimes when I take a break from working here, I go up, my office is located in Jishinglo, and there's a place where you can look at the view of Taipei City, basically. And sometimes I go up there and look at Taipei because I think it's such a beautiful city, and it's a good way to relax for me to look at that. And then when I looked at this photo of Pittsburgh, I thought, wow, Pittsburgh is so small. Right? This is basically like, what would you call this? It's just one area of Taipei, right? This is downtown Pittsburgh, where all the buildings are, and you could probably fit everything here in just one area of Taipei, right? When you look at Taipei, all the big buildings stretch on forever, right? You can do like this, and you're just looking at tall buildings the whole time. But this is what we have in Pittsburgh. So a little bit of information about Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Over 2.37 million people live in the greater Pittsburgh region. This is the city of Pittsburgh plus the surrounding areas. So actually there's not that many people who live downtown in this area. Most of the people are living all in these other areas around. Pittsburgh has some nicknames. Some people call it the Burg. Some people call it the Steel City because of its history of steel manufacturing. Pittsburgh has been ranked as one of the most livable cities in the United States and even the world. Why is that? Well, I think it looks kind of beautiful here, right? Low cost of living. If you want to buy a house in Taipei, you could probably buy like 10 houses in Pittsburgh, right? Maybe more. I didn't do the math on that, but houses in Pittsburgh are much cheaper than houses in Taipei. No earthquakes? Maybe very rarely, right? Hurricanes don't hit Pittsburgh because it's not on the coast, so like good weathers, not many natural disasters, low cost of living, so it's a livable city. Pittsburghers speak an English dialect that they call Pittsburghese, and it has been ranked as the ugliest dialect in America. I think if you're interested, you could search YouTube for Pittsburgh dad later on, and you'll hear a Pittsburgh accent. And Pittsburghers are sometimes called yinsers because Pittsburghese has a word yins, which is a second person plural pronoun. Do you guys know the word y'all from the South? It's a contraction of you all. So instead of saying y'all, Pittsburghers say yins. And it's a contraction of you ones, I guess. So second person plural pronoun, people in Pittsburgh say things like, oh, thanks for coming, yins guys. Yeah, so if you ever go to Pittsburgh and hear somebody say that, now you'll know what it means, if you remember. Okay, this is my neighborhood. I didn't live actually within the city. Like many people, I live outside of the city. This is a neighborhood called Swissvale, and you can see it looks pretty different from Taipei, right? It has many streets that are brick streets. You can see like the houses are back here. They have big yards with lots of plants and grass and trees. If you live in a place like this, you have to cut the grass and trim these bushes all the time. I am so glad that I live in Taipei. So time consuming to do this. Okay, at first you might have thought that this is a photo from Taipei, right? Because people from Taipei love doing this, right? Lining up at a restaurant to get food. So this is a place in Swissvale, in the neighborhood where I grew up. It's called the Triangle Bar and Grill. And so you can see, this is outside. People are lined up outside, and then the line continues all the way to the inside. So what are these people waiting for? They're all waiting for this. This is a kind of sandwich called a battleship. And it's a very famous sandwich in Pittsburgh and especially Swissvale. You can see this is a coffee pot here. So you can kind of judge how big this is. This is probably like, you know, it's probably about that long in real life, right? I can tell you it is delicious. Don't eat one every day. It's probably terrible for you. Well, not probably, it is terrible. But it's really good. So what happens, especially on the weekends during football season, American football, see this guy has a Pittsburgh Steelers shirt on. Before the game, you have to go and get a battleship so that while you watch these athletes competing with each other, you can stuff your face with this sandwich. Another thing that I think Pittsburgh is good for is pizza. I really like pizza, and there are a lot of good pizza places in Pittsburgh. This is Veltry's Pizza. This is also very close to where I grew up. You can drive there in like 5 minutes. And this is their pizza. A lot of people, when they talk about pizza in the US, they talk about places like New York and Chicago. Those places have good pizza. But not many people know that Pittsburgh actually has good pizza too. Part of the reason for that, where does pizza come from? Italy, right? There are a lot of people of Italian ancestry who live in Pittsburgh, right? So there were a lot of Italian immigrants who came to Pittsburgh a long time ago, and so that's one of the reasons that we have good pizza. I wanted to show you some other highlights here. So we have the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. This is the outside of it. And we have dinosaur bones. So there's actually a very good collection of fossils, dinosaur fossils, in our museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Yeah, so that's one thing we have. Another museum, do you guys know who Andy Warhol is? Have you heard of him before? So he's kind of a famous artist. He's from Pittsburgh, originally. So maybe you don't know that, but Andy Warhol is a Pittsburgher. And we have the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, which is another cool place to visit if you like Andy Warhol or art or any of those things. I went there maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and it was pretty cool. Okay, so the second place that I lived, Baltimore, Maryland. This is where I studied in grad school. And this is a photo of part of the city of Baltimore. Baltimore has an area called the Inner Harbor area. And this is the Inner Harbor. It's a kind of a tourist attraction in Baltimore. So a little bit of information about Baltimore. Over 2.7 million people live in the Baltimore metropolitan area. This is the city of Baltimore plus the surrounding areas. Baltimore also has some nicknames. It's called B-More. It's also called Charm City, and I'll try to show you in a moment why it's such a charming place. And the English dialect in Baltimore is called Balmorese, because when Baltimoreans say the word Baltimore, it often sounds like Baltimore. So a lot of people pronounce it that way, not everybody. Okay, this is the village, or the area of Baltimore where I lived. It's called Charles Village. And you can see they have these houses. They're different from the houses in Swissville, right? The houses in Swissville, you have a house, and then a big yard, and a space, and then there's another house, right? In Baltimore, they have row houses. These are houses where all the houses are basically touching each other. They're in a row, right? You can see each one of these things is a different house. And a while ago, maybe, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, they had some kind of competition, and basically the competition was to paint your house in the craziest way that you could think of, right? So you have these very bright colors, like who knew that blue and purple and yellow go together so well, right? So sometimes they call these painted ladies, the houses. And there was a competition. The best house, those people would get some kind of prize. I don't think there's a competition anymore, but this is something that people in Baltimore do. They try to make their house look very something. Okay, Baltimore's local beer is National Bohemian Beer. So this is Baltimore's version of Taiwan Pichu. So if you go to Baltimore, this is the kind of beer that you should definitely drink. People in Baltimore call it Natty Bo, or just Bo. So if you go to a place that serves it, you can just say, hey, can I get 3 Bows for you and your friends, right? And this guy, I don't know if you can see him, the guy on the can is Mr. Bo. Right? So this is what I would recommend drinking if you go to Baltimore. Here's something that I would recommend eating if you go to Baltimore. These are Utz potato chips. These are the most popular potato chips in Baltimore. They're actually made in Hanover, Pennsylvania, which is pretty close to Baltimore. And you can see we have the crab chip. One of the things that Baltimore is famous for is crabs. So you guys might like that place. Do you guys like eating crabs in Taiwan? Actually, just stay in Taiwan, because the crabs in Taiwan are better. But Baltimore also has crabs, so people spend time taking crabs apart and eating them. And there's crab potato chips. Part of the reason I showed you guys this is one of my favorite photos from Baltimore, my favorite advertisements. We have Mr. Bo, and he's asking the Utz potato chip girl to marry him. And so this was an advertisement. I don't know if it's still up for a jewelry store in Taiwan. It says where Baltimore gets engaged. So these are two kind of iconic symbols of Baltimore, and they're there together in that photo. Okay. One of the other things that makes Baltimore so charming is you see things that you might not see anywhere else in the world. So I remember on occasion I would see these guys, they have a horse and a horse-drawn cart, and they sell fruit on the street. And I'd never seen that in Pittsburgh, and I don't think I've seen that anywhere else in the world since I saw it in Baltimore. And so when I was preparing for today's presentation, I was thinking, oh, I should tell everybody about these guys. And so I Googled, Baltimore fruit, horse-drawn cart, and I found out that there is a word for these guys, the job that they do. I don't know exactly how to pronounce this, but it's like a rabber, I guess. So I just learned this word last week. That means you'll probably never need to know this word, but you know it now. So this is an old photo from 1985 that I found on the internet. But when I lived in Baltimore like 10, 15 years ago, I still saw things like this occasionally, and I hope they're still around because I think it's a very charming thing to have in Baltimore. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about my time studying at universities in the U.S. I studied at the University of Pittsburgh in my hometown, Pittsburgh. This is the Cathedral of Learning. This is a building on the campus of the University of Pittsburgh. And this is what it looks like inside. So you can see students are studying in here. I used to study here before and after my classes. And it kind of looks like a church, almost, right? That's why it's called a cathedral. Cathedral is kind of another word for church. And this is a very tall building, as you can see, right? These are pretty tall trees. And so it looks like some kind of skyscraper or something, right? So I felt very lucky to be able to study in a place like this. Pretty cool experience. And this is my time studying in Baltimore. So when I was in Baltimore, I studied at Johns Hopkins University. This is the building where I studied in Johns Hopkins, Gilman Hall. This is another area of campus called the Beach, where people just kind of hang out and study. It doesn't look like anybody's studying. Okay. So I thought maybe one thing you might be curious about, if you were at an American university, who would your classmates be, right? So I have a bit more data here. This is a demographic breakdown, right? About 54% of your classmates probably be white, 13% black, 20% Hispanic, 7.7% Asian Pacific Islander. So again, you can see diversity, right? You could see people from, or see, white people, black and African American, Hispanic people, right? And you'll also see international students like yourselves, right? These are the top 10, top 15 places where international students come from when they study in the U.S. So one of my favorite things about studying in the U.S. is that I was able to make friends with people from all over the world, right? So I knew people from Turkey, from the U.K., from Iran, Japan, Taiwan, Canada, South Korea, India, right? All of these places. And it was cool to just be able to meet people who come from different places, right? You kind of learn something about the world that way. Even though I never left my country at that point, and well, I went on trips, but even though I lived most of the time in the US, I could kind of somewhat experience other parts of the world through my friends who lived in other places. And so if you do study in the US, if anybody has an opportunity to study in the US, my advice it's okay to hang out with these people. That's fine. But hang out with some other people too, right? Try to make friends with some other people. If you do study in the US, it is a great opportunity to meet people from the US and from all over the world. And I would encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. I've heard some people say, if you study in the US, you don't even need to speak English, because you can just hang out with these people all the time. So I would say, you can hang out with them, and you don't have to speak English with them, but speak English with some other people. Hang out with some other people. Okay, so the United States of America, it's a big country. Different parts of the country are very different from each other. I spent a lot of time preparing today's presentation, and I still wasn't very happy with what I came up with. It was very difficult. I thought, what should I talk about for 30 minutes? What do people at NYCU need to know about the US that they don't already know? Probably not Baltimore's local beer, right? But I told you anyway. What would people at NYCU be interested in learning about the US? If you do have questions about the US, please feel free to ask me. And I think now we'll have like a short period of Q&A. If anybody wants to ask me any questions, I cannot promise that my answers will be good, but I'll try. Yeah.
What's the weather like, Mr.?
Great question. So we have all 4 seasons, kind of like how we have all 4 seasons in Taiwan. But in the summer, it is cooler and not as humid as Taiwan. In the winter, it is very cold. Sometimes it's often below 0 degrees, and it snows a lot. And when it snows, you have to shovel the snow. So again, I am so glad that I live in Taipei. So yeah, there's bigger temperature range, bigger differences. It gets really cold in the winter. So I try to go there in the summer. Other questions? Yeah, Jonathon.
Yeah, can we go back to the first slide?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Okay, I don't want to.
This one? Yes. So, how to pronounce it your last name?
Yeah, that's another great question. Yeah, most people in the US do not know how to pronounce this either. So we pronounce it in 2 ways. So Rico, like Rick-O, Rico is the way that we tell most people to pronounce it. Like many people in the US, like most people in the US, my ancestors are not originally from the US. My ancestors, half of them were from Slovakia in the US. And this is a Slovak name. So in Slovak, it's something like Hricko. So that's why, like, the H gets pronounced a little bit in the Hricko, but that's way too difficult for like 99% of Americans. So we just say Rico.
And I also found that many Americans, they like to shorten their first name. So like your name is Jonathan, but you might ask me to call you John.
Yeah.
Why?
I guess it's like a nickname. So like a lot of people in Taiwan, so yeah.
So
I'll give you an example. My wife's mom is named Lin Bi, and everybody calls her Ah.
my point is that when I meet Americans, I want to be polite.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether it is polite to call you without your last name, or you are the doctor, but I do not know how to pronounce it, Rico. So probably I should call you Dr. Rico, but because I don't know how to pronounce it that, then I call you Jonathan. Or I call you John, but I do not know whether I'm polite or you might feel that I'm rude.
This is a great question. Yeah. So I think in general, academics, like professors in the US, if they're meeting a professor from somewhere else in the world, they would probably think it's okay for you to just call them Jonathan, in my case, right? Because it's a bit more informal, right? So I don't think most people would get angry with you, you know, if you're meeting Professor Rico for the first time and you say, hey, Jonathan, it's great to meet you. I'm Jiaonan. It's great to meet you, right? I think that would be okay, like, most of the time. Some professors from the US are not originally from the US. They might be from a place where that is impolite. So they might think, oh, why is she calling me Jonathan and not Professor Rico? But yeah, it'll probably be okay. The other issue is pronouncing names. So, for example, if somebody in the US saw Jiaonan Laoshi's name written in letters, they would probably have no idea how to pronounce it, and they would definitely mispronounce it in some way, right? So, same thing here. I bet 95% of the time, if you say something like, oh, Professor Harikio, nice to meet you. 95% of the time, people are going to be like, yeah, that's me, close enough. Yeah. You can call me Jonathan, it's easier, right? So the other thing I would say, I tell my students this, if you don't know how to pronounce somebody's name, just try. And 95% of the time, the worst thing that will happen is they'll say, actually, it's pronounced Rico, but you can call me Jonathan. Right? But some people will get mad, but let's not worry about this. But you can't just say, hey, professor. You have to try something, I think. So, yeah, great question. So, other questions? Well, you know what happens if there are no questions, right?
Yeah, I think also when you mentioned that living cost is low in Pittsburgh, and I think that's also the reality, because I have my PhD training in Minnesota, the countryside. So when I travel to the East Coast, wow, the expensive there is just high, way high, too high. So I think it's also the relatives.
Totally, yeah. So I experienced this whenever I went to study in Baltimore, right? So the cost of living in Pittsburgh is pretty low, and one of the things that people told me in Baltimore is that, yeah, the cost of living in Baltimore is pretty low. And why do they say that? Because it's lower than New York, right? But it's not lower than Pittsburgh. So when I went there, I was like, what are you talking about? The cost of living is higher in Baltimore, right? So it's all relative, and if you look at other places in the US too, like what you would pay for an apartment in, say, Iowa would be much less than Pittsburgh, which would be much less than Baltimore, which would be much less than New York. So, yeah, it's all relative. Yeah, Jen?
I'm just wondering that, can you sell both as Pittsburgh River and, well, those rivers, the bridge can separate to allow both get over it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Pittsburgh is famous for having 3 rivers: the Allegheny, the Monongahela, and the Ohio rivers. And I don't think any of those bridges do this kind of thing, but I think there are some bridges that do that in the Pittsburgh area. And so, yeah, you can sail a boat on the rivers. People have boats, and you know they sail them on the rivers for fun. Maybe they go fishing too. But yeah, Pittsburgh used to have a football stadium called Three Rivers Stadium because the Three Rivers is one of the things that Pittsburgh is famous for. Yeah, Jonathon老师.
I don't have the question, but I do have a suggestion for you.
Yeah.
I mean, you should change the photo. You put the Captain America Museum, right?
Yeah.
But actually, you should put John Wick. Is it John Wick? I have to say this because now he has a movie right here, and I have to say for girls, you all have the dreams that one day you can, marry with some superstar, movie star. And I have to say my 学姐, now she's lucky because she intended to ask Jonathon to let his hair longer. So now he looks like more like the John Wick. So I think he's not a good teacher, but he's a very good looking teacher.
I'm glad you said that about my wife because I was going to say it and I thought maybe I would get in trouble for saying that. But you will not get in trouble.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, so because of time, maybe we can go for the next part.
The pop quiz?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a pop quiz and I was told to announce some ground rules for the pop quiz. So if you know the answer, raise your hand. And I think Nancy and Jesse and Elizabeth might help me to figure out who raises their hand first. So I'll focus on asking the questions and we'll see where we go. So which region of the United States is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania located in?
You want to count down?
Yeah, maybe you can count down.
Okay. From 100?
From 3 to 1.
Okay. 3, 2, 1.
The northeast of America.
Excellent. Yeah, very good. So Pittsburgh is located in the Northeast. Some people think it's in the Midwest, but that's not actually true. So, good. The Northeast is the correct answer. So which famous artist was born in Pittsburgh? 3, 2, 1. Is your art okay?
Sorry.
Andy Warhol. That's exactly right. So we have the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What are the colorful row houses in Baltimore called? They have a nickname. So 3, 2, 1.
Avery.
Okay.
Painted lady.
Yeah, Painted Lady. That's great. So they have the Painted Lady in Baltimore. Very good. What kind of beer do people in Baltimore drink? So 3, 2, 1.
Mr. Bo.
Yeah, Mr. Bo, right? Mr. Bo is the guy. We got Mr. Bo there, and we got National Bohemian Beer. Excellent. Final question. What second person plural pronoun similar to y'all do people in Pittsburgh use? Do you guys remember this one? So 3, 2, 1. Yeah. Yes. That's exactly right. And so I want to end my presentation today. Thanks you guys for coming to my presentation.